Hi everyone, the painting that you see behind me I created a few years ago. It's acrylic on canvas and it measures 57 inches long by 37 inches high. In addition to painting on a medium and a large scale, I also like to paint on a very small scale, and I often create these watercolor miniatures that measure 2.5 inches high by 3.5 inches long. I enjoy the process of making miniature paintings for a variety of reasons. Not only do I like the look of tiny paintings, but painting on a tiny scale provides an opportunity to experiment with technique before applying it to a larger composition. In this video demonstration, I'm going to walk you through the steps on how to create a miniature watercolor painting with the orchid as its subject matter. And I'll be drawing it on a tiny piece of Arches watercolor paper that measures 2.5 inches high by 3.5 inches wide. I begin the drawing by analyzing the placement by breaking up the surface of my paper with a general placement of the basic shapes. So I will make the tiny orchid fit in this circular shape here, and I don't want it to go any lower. There's a little petal there and there, and the center is just about here. My process of drawing is to begin with a general approximation of where things are going to go, then begin to break the subject up into smaller parts, smaller component parts. And without erasing, evaluate how you've broken up the subject into those smaller parts and make corrections. After the corrections are made, then you can gradually erase some of the preliminary marks. If I position everything based on my analysis of angles and proportions, the drawing will be reasonably accurate. I scanned the original drawing you see me creating into my computer and cleaned up the line work. Then I printed the clean version of the drawing onto 140-pound Arches watercolor paper, and it is this printed version that I'll paint on. Because I have a digital copy of this original drawing, I can also create variations on this watercolor painting. I will start with the large petals of the flower, since they are the dominant structure that gives definition to this beautiful tiny orchid. And in analyzing the petals in the photo, I see they modulate from a very light base color of cerulean blue to a quinacridone type of red, which is over here. So, to start off, I'm going to dampen the petal. For me, watercolor always involves an analysis of what the color is actually doing in the area that I intend to paint. Then I orchestrate a method of approach, and this is exactly what I'm doing here. Having dampened that, I'm going to go to my cerulean blue. Take a little of that blue and bring it into this area. Okay, and that darkens with a little of the blue right in that area, so I'll get a little bit more here. I need to allow that to dry before I can continue with anything else. And I can't paint anything adjacent because this is all wet, and I want to have the adjacent areas maintain their individual identities. So, time to leave it alone. Now that my base color of blue is completely dry, and it is, I'm going to redampen the area and begin to establish the reds that I see. Now that may sound contradictory, I allow it to dry, but I'm going to redampen it. Why is that? By allowing it to dry 100%, and I mean make sure it's thoroughly dry. You can even hit that with a hairdryer to guarantee that it is. The gum arabic that binds the watercolor to the paper has literally glued the color in place and will resist becoming soluble again when you re-wet it. Therefore, I can safely dampen the area and start to work in a secondary layer of colors without affecting the bottom layer, as long as I don't get carried away with my brushing. So let's step back and have a look at the subject matter that I'm viewing on the tablet and analyze what's going on in the petal structure. We see veins that are relatively soft focus, and in addition to that, we see a general tonality of quinacridone red as a base color throughout these larger petals. What I will do is apply another layer of color to achieve that base tonality. Then when that's dry, I'll show you how I create soft focus veins. The next step is to wet the area that I want the paint to flow once again. And I'll do that by applying a dot of clean water and moving it around with my number 6 brush. I don't want there to be any standing pools of water, but I want a thoroughly dampened surface. See how it looks? And quinacridone red is very close to the actual color of the petal. Now I'll work in the red. And as you move towards the edge of the petal, the bluish tonality dominates. As I look at the photo, the red area of the petal has a kind of dappled quality. To achieve that, I'm going to sprinkle on just a little bit of salt. I'm very careful with the use of salt to create effects because I don't want it to become gimmicky. But in this case, I think it would be the best way to achieve that dappled effects. So I'm using a little bit of regular table salt. We need to let it dry before we can go any further. I allowed it to dry completely. There's no dampness at all to the paper. The salt is still on it. See that? That's a nice view of the salt. To remove it, I'll brush it off with a flat paintbrush. That should do it. If for some bizarre reason it didn't do it, a clean toothbrush would definitely and very easily work it off. That's the dappled quality that I was speaking about. But now the challenge is going to be the development of the veins. So you see how the veins form these darker structures that interweave with the base color that we just applied. The edges are soft, they're not sharp. Once again, I dampen the petal, spread my clean water. You might be interested to know I'm using distilled water. I always paint with distilled water. Now, switching to my zero brush, I pick up some of the quinacridone red. But I want it to be relatively dry, or at least drier than the wash application. Now keep in mind, this is watercolor, And often in watercolor, you can see a little bit of the drawing showing through. That's what's happening here. It's one of the beautiful qualities of watercolor. Traces of the original drawing remain visible. By working in wet paint into wet paint, the lines bleed a little and become soft focus. I'm establishing the detail in that central area and allowing it to bleed back into the petal. Re-wetting this area to allow the paint to flow up to an edge line that I see in my drawing. That's an important little detail. Okay, we'll leave it alone. This area is completely dry, 100% dry. And before I continue to develop the adjacent petals, I think I need to resolve the central area. Looking at the actual photo, one challenge will be to create this delicate little line that overlaps this structure. Now, there are two ways I can go about doing that. One is to leave the area here dry and paint around it. A much more efficient method would be to apply some masking material to this filament-like structure to protect it from the background wash. Then when the background wash is completely dry, I remove the masking material and paint in the filament. And that's what I'm going to do. The masking material that I use is Pabio drawing gum. What I like about it is its dark color. Here's a dry little bit of masking material. You can see it right there. Its dark color stands out so you can see where you actually have applied it. Now, to apply the masking fluid, I put it in this little bottle for convenience. It's a nice way of dispensing what I need. Sometimes I can work directly on my piece and apply the masking fluid. For this, I'm going to just get a little bit of masking fluid on a piece of paper. Dip my brush into it. It's also important to note that I just rinsed my brush in soapy water. This prevents the masking fluid from binding with the hairs of the brush and ruining the brush. So when I'm doing a large area, I periodically rinse it out in soapy water. Now I'm painting in that filament structure. Masking fluid is only applied to paper that is 100% dry. If the paper is not 100% dry, the masking fluid will get into the fiber of the paper and you'll never be able to remove it. There we go. See the masking fluid? Now I have to let that dry before I can resume painting in this area. Don't be impatient and attempt to dry that with a hairdryer. If you do, you're going to degrade the material, the masking material. It's going to get soft and mushy and never be effectively removed from the paper. Another thing you don't want to do is put the masking fluid in the sunlight. The UV rays from the sunlight will also break down this rubber-like material and make it soft and mushy, and you're not going to be able to remove it from the paper. You're going to ruin your piece. So be patient, let it dry. Then when you're certain that it's dry, resume work. Now I'm rinsing off my brush in a little bit of water that has soap added to it. Regular dishwashing soap is fine. It's been about a half hour since I applied that masking material. Now the dominant color down there is the permanent magenta. So I go to my magenta. and I flow it in. See how easy it is now to work around the filaments? I simply ignore where they're going to go and paint right over them. Masking material can be very effective stuff to use. It lightens up in this area, so I'm going to put some plain, clean water. It also takes on a slight yellow cast using Winsor yellow. I put in just a little bit. Now that the color is added, I believe I should pull it out a little bit more. I'm going to introduce a little ultramarine down here. I am working with my number 0 brush. This is so tiny. Now this area is dry, so I can continue to develop the structure of the adjacent central petals. I'm going to use a little bit of the quinacridone. I also need to get some cobalt blue into that. And there will also be some Winsor yellow. Now I'm going to work in my quinacridone. It actually works down to a fairly deep magenta right about there. Touch of blue up here. Gotta be careful. I don't want to get too much in there. And actually a little yellow right about there. That's the first layer of colors. I will work in some of the motley dots I see on top of that when that area is completely dry. But it's doing what I was hoping it would do, so I'll leave it alone. I like the way the watercolors, the different colors are beginning to run into one another. There is little dots of very intense alizarin crimson on the inside of this petal. So once the washes are established that create the foundation color, I can work in these details. After I lay in a little of the color, I'll often put a little tiny dot of water into that. I like the way it pushes the color around. And I'll lay in the foundation wash of cerulean blue. I'm also laying the foundation wash of the blue down here. The area has been pre-dampened. Eventually that petal is going to be in the shade. I continue to lay in the smaller petals that we see, these 3 petals, with my cerulean blue. Then when the cerulean blue is dry, I dampen the paper again and painted in the veins. These structures here are a medium tone Winsor yellow. So I prepare my color. I'll flow in some of that Winsor yellow. Also, this area has a little detail, sort of like that. It's actually quinacridone red and cobalt blue mixture, creating a type of violet. This little unopened bud has sort of a brownish, greenish, reddish quality to it. So before I worry about these marks here, these linear marks that go down, I'm going to apply a base coat to suggest all of those colors. And as usual, I'm dampening it first. So I will work in a beautiful burnt sienna. Now into that burnt sienna, a little of that quinacridone. A little of my mixed green. Yeah. And I should leave it alone. See the very subtle hint of the redder color there, the green down there, and that beautiful brown up there. When that's dry, I'll introduce the vertical linear elements. These are fuzzy looking lines. Next, I'm going to create relatively sharp lines. I'll dampen the area. Now the lines in the photo actually have a magenta quality, so I'm going to apply a wash of magenta, permanent magenta. How do I turn that into a sharp line? Well, I suck out some of that paint. Then flow in some clean water. Can you see it? What it causes is the paint pigment to precipitate down along the edge or the perimeter of the water, the wet area. Now I have to let that dry before I can paint in the adjacent areas. But I can paint in areas that are not touching. Let's create a more graphic example. We'll go with a darker magenta. Now, instead of lifting that magenta out right away, I'm going to flow in water. The water pushed the pigment towards the edge. I can't do anything now. I have to let that dry. There's a little bit of a shadow area right down here. I use either cobalt blue or French ultramarine blue for my shadows. This time I'm going to use the cobalt blue. I'm dampening the whole area. Now I see the shadow right over here. And it tucks in a little bit over here too. Okay, let's leave that. The stem is an interesting color. It's a combination of burnt sienna and green. So I believe what I'll do is start with a wash of burnt sienna. And then into that, I will flow my mixed green. Using my number 6, now I apply a significant amount of the green. Something that I've been wanting to do for a while now is to establish these highlights by scratching in. And this is an area that the highlight is much needed. See, with transparent watercolor painting, it's the white of the paper that creates the whites that are in the painting. And sometimes it's necessary to lift out some color. The X-Acto knife is an excellent tool for doing this. And I always brush away the scratchings with a clean, dry brush. Never use your finger. the very subtle indication of a line down the center of this form. So I've dampened it with water, like you saw me do over here. That actually picked up some of the paint and is already starting to create a subtle line. I may not even need to add any more color. But since I need to push this slightly towards the red, I'm going to flow in a dilute wash of quinacridone red. A little more water, and we'll let it dry. Then most likely I'm going to return to that side and do the same thing. In addition to this shadow that I just put in, there's an important shadow in this area. The shadow is very soft focus. Before I do any more scratching out of color to bring out highlights, first develop the shadow areas. Hold off on developing the highlights until all the shadows are in place. The shadow needs to bleed into this area. This area is going to be in shadow, and the shadow lightens up down here. Go into a light cobalt blue. I work it in. I've dampened the entire background, as you can see, by the reflection in the light. This is in preparation to lay in the background colors. What I do is I paraphrase what I see in the photograph, but I don't copy any details. At least I usually don't copy details. I simply flow in color areas to suggest the colors that I see. This is exactly what I do on my large pieces. This is a very dark area in the photograph, so I'm going right to a neutral tint. If I was painting on a full sheet of watercolor, which is 22 by 30, I'd be using very large brushes. And I see a significant amount of blue poking through, blue and green. So I'll just put it in. The idea is to create a beautiful field of colors, suggesting out-of-focus things. A little burnt sienna would be good down there. I see it in the photo. And actually, I wouldn't mind having that transition to a yellow ochre. But it's important to maintain a sense of continuity. And right there, see where that stem is? It's important to carry the color here to there. Otherwise, it's not going to look right. Cobalt blue. And make sure that the colors of the background, if they poke through anywhere, that I carry it through. And I'll often lift color from one area and apply it to another. Well, it's the next day. I allowed it to dry overnight. And now it's time to remove the masking material that's been protecting this little tiny detail. What I use is my kneaded eraser. You could also use a rubber cement pickup or even your finger to get it going, although I don't recommend that because the moisture in your finger just might smudge the paint. The kneaded eraser is the safest bet. And all you do is erase into it. See what's happening? there it goes, ready to be painted. Wonderful. The final thing to do is to paint this, but what I'm doing in the interim before I get to that is I'm moving around the surface and just working out highlights. Dragging my razor blade across the surface of the beautiful tiny orchid to pick up some of the texture that I see on the petals. Now I'm dampening that delicate filament area with clean water in preparation for the application of paint. Next, I flow in quinacridone red. That's it. Time to let it dry. I finished the tiny watercolor by painting a thin border around it, and it's time to sign it. I sign these very tiny watercolors with a rapidograph pen because it allows me to get in there with a fine point and write my name legibly. The miniature watercolor is finished. I hope you enjoyed watching the video.